Hey there, today's podcast is all about sound design at Disney's theme parks with my guest Greg Meader, who worked on many iconic Disney attractions, including Spaceship Earth, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, and even Food Rocks. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 67 of the Tomorrow Society Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton. And one thing I've really enjoyed during the last 3.5 years doing this podcast has been the chance to connect with some lesser-known figures behind the scenes at Walt Disney Imagineering. When I say lesser-known, I'm not referring at all to their skills. It's just that the way Disney operates, we only learn about a few lead Imagineers out in front of a project and not about all the talented individuals that work behind the scenes. The perfect example is my guest this week, Greg Meader. And I actually connected with Greg after I started writing my current blog series, Spaceship Earth Scene by Scene, where I'm going through each individual scene of EPCOT's iconic attraction. Greg reached out to me after I did my introductory post for that series and indicated that he had worked on the sound design for the Jeremy Irons edition of Spaceship Earth. And I immediately wanted to connect with him to talk about that. And what I discovered after doing a little bit of research on Greg's career and then after talking with him is how many great attractions he worked on during his career at Disney, including Splash Mountain, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, and Phantom Manor at Disneyland Paris. He also worked on Food Rocks and has a few fun stories about that odd attraction at EPCOT. And I even got to ask him about a curiosity for me, the Stargate SG-3000 attraction, which I never experienced but have an interest in given my love for Stargate SG-1. It was just a lot of fun to talk with Greg, learn about his career, and he has a lot of cool stories about his time working at Imagineering. Before I get to that conversation, I did want to mention that you can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. This is a listener-supported podcast, so the small pledge of $1 or $2 per episode can make a huge difference in helping to keep the show going. You also receive some fun perks, including an additional monthly podcast, the Tomorrow Society Bulletin, and an official pin and membership card for the Tomorrow Society. It's a great way to keep this show going and ensuring that I can connect with really cool guests like Greg. And you can learn more by going to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. That's patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. So this was a blast to record. Greg was so much fun and generous with his time. So I'm super excited for you to get the chance to hear this show. Let's go talk to Greg Meader. What was your experience like with Disneyland or with Disney in general when you were younger?
Well, I live in California, Southern California, about 8 miles from the park at Disneyland. So, as a youth, I went there a lot. It was kind of neat because we didn't go every weekend, but we had access to it. So I'd go quite a bit. And, I have pictures of me when I'm 3 years old out there with my grandma. So I have a long history of being a guest at the park. As I got older, I still would go. And finally, in 1980, I got hired as a musician out there for the Christmas parade, the Fantasyland parade, and that began my Disney career.
When you were going and you were younger, I mean, obviously, like you said, you lived there, so it was something you enjoyed. Did you have any thought that it would ultimately lead where you'd end up working for them? Was that something you aspired for, or did you kind of just enjoy it like many guests?
No, I just kind of enjoyed it. It was never, I had some friends when I'm a drummer. So when I was in my teens, I had some of my instructors who worked out there in the parades, and I kind of thought, hey, that'd be kind of a fun job. But I never really, I can tell you, I didn't sit there every day just going, man, I've got to work there. It was never really part of my. It was it was an option, but it wasn't like my only option. That that was kind of my view on it.
I think that's pretty common with people that work there. I mean, yes, there always are a few stories of somebody who just wants to do it, but a lot of people I feel like I've talked with, I wouldn't say stumble upon it, but all of a sudden end up working there for a variety of reasons, like you mentioned. So you mentioned you were a drummer, and I know you work in sound design. So how did you get interested in doing that when you were younger?
I don't know, just one of those things where I can honestly trace it back to one incident in about sixth grade. We had a reel-to-reel tape recorder in class, and we were recording people giving speeches, and me and one other guy were assigned to run the tape recorder. And I remember sitting there, pushing the record button, watching the reels move, looking up at the wall, seeing the clock move to time it. There was not like an epiphany like, this is it, but I can trace everything back to that moment. Like, I think this would be kind of a fun thing to do. So I kind of, started heading down that path with sound. And, I was just always interested in music and sound and just, stuff like that.
It's interesting that it was fairly early, obviously, that you had such a connection to it. And you mentioned that you had performed at Disneyland, and then ultimately that kind of started you on that path. So how did that go, where you eventually started working there later in the 80s?
Well, what I did is I was at Disneyland for 3 years, just seasonal, casual, doing parades and, seasonal parades, Easter, Christmas, special events, things like that. And in 1983, I was in the All-American College Band program there, and I was an alternate, so I wasn't really playing much, but I was on the roster, so that was kind of cool. And then in 1983, I was offered a full-time job to go down to EPCOT and play in the Future World Brass, and I took them up on it. So from 1983 to 1987, I wore white and stood out in Future World and played a lot of stuff, a lot of songs.
So what was that experience like? Because that was so early for the park, and I know a lot of my listeners, and myself included, love that era. So what was it like, though, playing just out in the Florida sun all the time at Epcot?
Well, it was interesting to me because myself and friends and family could not believe that I was getting paid just to play drums. Because they would ask me, what's your job? And I said, well, it's to play drums out in the park. And they said, but what else do you do? And I said, well, that's it. That's all I do. And so it took them a while to just kind of grasp the concept of just getting paid to play drums. For me, growing up out here with Disneyland, I'd never seen another Disney park. So I remember the first time when I drove out there with another musician that had got hired. We drove out there together. And we pulled into Epcot in the back employee parking lot. And it was very strange because it's like this whole Disney world out there, literally the world, and I'd never seen it. And it was just, it felt weird because it was like, I can't believe there's a whole nother Disney universe that I never knew about. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I'd never been there. And, but you kind of get used to that. And then you get you learn your job and you go out and you start playing. And, Epcot was a new park at the time, like you said. So it was kind of fun because it was, it was a good time in life. I'll say that.
I can imagine getting to play drums and hang out in, around Epcot and everything. That doesn't sound like a bad gig. So when did it change where after that you ended up kind of moving on to the next stage of your career?
Well, when I was out there, the studio tour was being planned. And at the time, there was just a dirt road, literally a dirt road behind Epcot that was leading to what would eventually become that park. And I was with a friend of mine that was working out there. And I said, where's that road go to? And he said, they're building a new park. And that's where all the Imagineers are at, working on the park. And that was the first time I think I'd ever heard the word Imagineering. I'd heard of WED. And I'd kind of heard it bantered about a little bit. But he goes, yeah, those people all do all the design work. And I thought, man, that sounds like a lot of fun. At that point, I said, I sort of made it my mission to try to get into Imagineering. And this was about 1986. And I said, that's something I got to really try and do. That's kind of how it began. And then I'm being from California, the band in Florida in 1987, moved back here, finished some school, and, got a job working in the post-production industry out here in Burbank, North Hollywood area, working on movies and television projects. And at that point, Imagineering is, it's in Glendale, and I knew where it was. And I would go over, this was pre-internet, so if you wanted to find a job there, you had to physically drive there and go in the lobby and look in this little green book that was on the counter. And it was just there. And, I saw the book and there was nothing in there for me, but I still applied just because. And then, of course, I got rejected because there was no job. And so about every 2 months on my lunch hour, I'd run over there and just flip through the book. And so one day I saw it said audio production specialist. And I said, well, there you go. So I applied. And for me, the rest is history. It worked out.
Yeah, I guess it did. Well, it's interesting, too, because part of me thinks that was almost not easier because obviously you had to be diligent and have the experience, but being able to just go in there and look at a book, it's like compared to now, it's almost a nice way to be able to do it. But I mean, so you mentioned that was around like 87 or so in the late 80s, right?
Yeah. I actually started interviewing in September of 88 and actually got hired in February of 89. So it's like it was over Christmas, so there was some time off, but it was about a 4-month process. Yeah, it was kind of like a kindler, gentler time back then. It wasn't, it was very, like you kind of just mentioned, it was, you walk in the front lobby, you say hi to the security guard, you look at the book, you sit in a chair and you read it through it. So it's very, it's very, I don't know, it's a totally kind of a different atmosphere than it is today.
Pretty soon after that, I mean, it seems like you were then working on Disneyland Paris, working on a project there. How quickly did that happen? And what was that like to kind of get involved with that project?
Well, I believe it was probably going on by the time I started at the company. But working in audio is kind of like one of the last things that gets done. So a lot of our production, we were aware of a project for a year or two ahead of time, but we didn't really actually do a lot of work till about the final 6 months. We would do some recording and things like that, but actual mixing and editing and, getting it ready to go in for installation would happen in like the final 6 months. So, we would have meetings, and one day we were at a meeting and we had a list of all the, at the time it was called EDL, Euro Disneyland. And we had a list of all the EDL projects. And we kind of went around the room and said, who wants to work on what? And we just sort of picked things. And it was none of us, like at the time, it was interesting for me because Phantom Manor was the one I ended up working on. But at that meeting, I remember it was sort of discussed that it was just simply a copy of Disneyland's Haunted Mansion and there wouldn't be a lot of production work involved. So a lot of people passed on it. And, a couple of the guys that were senior to me passed on it. And then it came to me and I said, I'll take it. And it's one of my favorite Disney projects. So I'm really glad that I took it. But at the time, you didn't really know what it was going to be. It was just simply it was a lift from Disneyland, but it turned into so much more, at least from what I was doing on it.
Oh, yeah. I went there once in 2006 and really wish I could have we were only there a day, and I wish I could have ridden that about 15 times because like a few rides through it did not save time because it's kind of like the Haunted Mansion, but yet with the whole being in Frontierland and the Western feel and so many things like you did, I just feel like what they did with the story was so interesting. So tell me, like, what was it like when you really got into working on that attraction? Because to me, it's still one of the most interesting attractions Disney's done anywhere.
Like I said, I really enjoyed it. Jeff Burke, the show producer, he had an amazing concept of what it was going to be. He would have like some drawings and some artwork, and he'd say, here's what it's going to look like. Here's what I want it to sound like. And then he would leave. And that was the best thing because he goes, I'll be back in a week. Or, we'd schedule another meeting. And in that time, I just worked on stuff, kind of not really unsupervised, but in essence, unsupervised, at least from a creative standpoint. So I would just kind of come up with things. And, the music was written by John Debney. Well, not written, but rearranged by John Debney. He took the original themes and reorchestrated it and kind of came up with his, the whole Phantom Manor suite. So, we were getting some temp tracks from him and, just compiling sound effects and just, different effects and just kind of trying to create what Jeff was asking for. And then he'd come back in and listen to it and go, I like that, or I don't like that, do it this way. And, but he always had this grand concept of what it should be. And I always, that was always appreciative because, I was always sure what he wanted. It was kind of neat because he would say something, then he would leave, he'd come back and he'd listen to it and he goes, yeah, that's it. It was a good experience all around.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I feel like the music, I was listening to that suite today and the music about it, it's a little more eerie, like a little creepier than even not like in a frightening way, but it has a different feel to it. I mean, how much just from your experience of just hearing what Jeff wanted and then John, was that a conscious decision to try and make this just a little bit scarier from what you could tell?
That was sort of decided long before I got on the project. So I don't know. I mean, yes, it sounds like that's, I think that's kind of what Jeff was going for, but I don't have any inside knowledge on that part of it. I know that an original kind of a temp track was done by Christian Hope. Anyway, Christian did a kind of a temp track on a synthesizer. And I remember we took some, we took Vincent Price's Laugh from the Thriller album from Michael Jackson. And we took Christian's demo track and we threw some sound effects in there and we kind of cut this little demo together. And I remember we played it back and it was just one of those things where for the first time you could kind of get a feel for how it was going to sound and look like, or not look like, but sound. Jeff and I and a couple other people just looked at each other and went, man, this thing is just going to edit itself. It's amazing. So kind of from that point, it just sort of, I want to say the show edited itself. We got effects, we got music, we put it together. I recorded Vincent Price, we put that in there, and then wham, it just kind of came together. Of course, we didn't end up using Vincent Price, but, his laugh was in there.
Yeah, that story is so interesting how that changed. So when you're designing, and this is my lack of being inside WDI and how it works, but so you're doing this, are you doing this in Glendale, or is this something where you actually ultimately are able to go to the actual attraction and test things out? Like, how does that work when you're doing sound effects and on other things there?
Well, you're based in Glendale. We had we had studios there and edit bays at in Glendale, right in the 1401 building, and we would that was our home base. And so a lot of stuff, a lot of sound effects and things you'd get out of a library, or Joe Harrington, who was the sound effects guru at the time, he would go out in the field and record just stuff. And Joe was great because Joe had learned from Jimmy McDonald, who Jimmy is sound effects number one in the history of sound effects because he started out in those early Mickey Mouse cartoons. So Joe Joe learned a lot from him. And anyway, I guess what I'm saying is Joe was really good. He would go out in the field and record stuff, and then he'd bring it back, and then he would, he'd give you things and you'd start editing and cutting stuff together. But it would all happen in Glendale. But a lot of the music, a lot of times would just be recorded, like the music for Phantom was recorded over Abbey Road over in London. So different things are recorded different areas, like different studios. It wasn't all done at WDI, but that was where sort of HQ for audio.
It's kind of amazing how the different, like you said, the different places you're kind of recording, and then it all comes together and you're in an attraction, and it's, this just kind of feels like it should be, but all the things behind the scenes that we don't see.
Well, correct. Yeah, you do, you work out of Glendale, but everything a lot of stuff gets voiceovers. Sometimes they'd come into WDI, but a lot of times, like, they won't be in California, so you'll fly to wherever they are. And then when you get everything done and edited and mixed to it's all ready to go, then you go to the field and you do the installation, it's a whole different set of circumstances. But yeah, you're in the field and you're running up and down stairs and you've got a tool belt and you're just, you become kind of a construction worker for a month. You got the hard hat, the safety boots, the vest, all the stuff. And then you just, you just make sure it's all working. And it's an interesting time because there's about 50 different disciplines all trying to work at the same time. So it's a lot of scheduling. And, I always used to joke, it's a 24/7 job. You don't work 24/7, but you're available to work 24/7. Painters are going to be in there from 7 p.m. till midnight. And then show programming, the animatronic guys get it from noon to 4, or I'm sorry, midnight to 4 a.m. Audio, you can have it from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. There's your work schedule.
That sounds really hectic. I was going to ask if, given that it was part of the new park, if there was was there a lot of pressure? I mean, do you guys feel the pressure of, the fact that it had to be completed? From your experience, I know you were just doing certain parts, but for the opening and just everything had to be right?
I didn't feel a lot of pressure because I just had a specific set of things to get done, but I would walk around the park thinking, I don't see how this is going to get done by April.
Yeah.
Because I was there in February. It's amazing how things can come together quickly, but I don't know. I didn't feel that pressure because I just, I'm just one little cog in the machine. So at that point, it was Mickey Steinberg, who was the number 2 guy at Imagineering, I think, for project management, and it was on his shoulders. And so I'm sure he was feeling the pressure because it was, it was his responsibility to get that park built and opened. And so I didn't feel anywhere near the pressure. I'm sure he did.
Well, yeah, and I think it's kind of set up that way so that people that are doing individual jobs can do well, and then the people up high can sweat it out and get very nervous and not get any sleep and all that. It's probably designed that way.
I'm sure there were plenty of meetings that I wasn't privy to where a lot of things were discussed about, how are we going to do this? But I was just, in my, what is it? My bliss, but my innocence, it just that wasn't part of what I was dealing with. So I knew nothing about that.
So I want to make sure I ask about Spaceship Earth, which I know still, it's like we mentioned early days of Epcot. It's one of those original Future World pavilions that actually is still there. Now, granted, it has changed. We're on version number 4 and may go to version number 5 at some point, but you were working on obviously the version with Jeremy Irons that opened in 1994. So, which is a beloved version, but by now, especially now that it's been gone for 12 years. But what was that experience like? How did you get involved in that project?
Again, I don't remember exactly. We would have, we'd have production meetings, and we would be, like our manager would get a list of projects that were coming up, and he would just, go down the list. We'd have a meeting, and we'd say, okay, who's available? Who wants to do this? Who wants to do that? And there were some of us, like I had worked on Splash Mountain, so I was kind of the water ride, boat ride guy. Another guy, Sam, had done a lot of the Circle Vision thing, so he was the film guy. So we all kind of had like kind of areas that we tended to work in. I guess you'd call it a specialty. But Spaceship Earth was since it wasn't it was a redo or a update. It wasn't considered like a major project. It wasn't like like Splash Mountain was from ground to an open attraction. But Spaceship Earth was already existing, and so a lot of the stuff like sound effects and that type of stuff can be reused. It was different music, but the sound effects and the different scenes were, we didn't change that at all because there was no reason to. We just had a meeting, and it's like, Greg, do you want to work on this? Yes. Okay, it's yours. And then you get a hold of the right people, the project manager or the the scheduling people, and say, okay, let me know when the meetings are, and then you just get your notebook, you go to the meeting, and there you go. You're on it.
That is different, like you said, because, they have new scenes and such, but then a lot of it is similar. So I know you mentioned that a lot of the sound effects could be reused, but there were areas like the back half of it and then the descent that had a lot of new elements. So were there areas where you were either, having new sound effects or doing new mixing beyond the music in order to put that together?
Yeah. The way a project worked was that as the audio production person, on that particular attraction, I didn't create the sound effects. That was Joe Harrington that did that. So I would just, I'd go to Joe and say, Joe, give me, when you're done with what you're doing, let me know, like give it to me. So he would give me the effects that he had done. So, and then, we'd have a list of the existing effects, and we would just go through and pick out which ones were going to be deleted or not used and which would be replaced. But the music was all new, and that was all mixed. We remixed or rebalanced everything in the ride, starting from zero. So it was a lot of different elements involved, but we would take old stuff that was there, and then we would, listen to it and go, okay, that sounds fine. There's no need to, redo that. Cause a lot of times some of these effects at Epcot, like especially from the original versions of the shows, when Epcot opened, and I wasn't there, so this is secondhand information, but there was a lot of things to get done. And a lot of times you just put stuff in as a temp track to keep it there. So you got sound. And then after the park opens, you're like, okay, let's go back and fix that. Like that was the case on American Adventure. There were some, rhythm tracks that were just put in as kind of holding temp tracks. And when we did that redo in 92, we finally replaced those. So, some of these temp tracks lasted 10 years.
Yeah, I talked to Steve Alcorn. He did a lot of the show engineering on the original Epcot Center, and his stories about kind of what they did with, like you mentioned how Paris was. It sounds like Epcot Center was even more that way, where like it was basically dirt until like so soon before. So I'm sure that especially with something like Spaceship Earth, that getting and American Adventure, getting the chance to upgrade that probably was good for a lot of reasons, but especially probably also enjoyable for you, I'm sure, to kind of get that input for it, right?
It was fun for me, like Spaceship Earth especially, because, when I was in the Future Road Brass, we would play our opening set every morning right underneath the ball, right out facing the front gate. So, I saw that ride, not on the inside. I stood in front of that ride every day for 4 years. And, I'd ridden it quite a bit, and I was starting to just, thinking, at that point, not right away, but mid 80s, after having been a musician there for a couple of years, I was starting to think, I think this Imagineering thing is kind of a way that I want to go. So then I started paying more attention to the attractions and trying to figure out how things were done and, from a technical standpoint. So Spaceship Earth was always, when I got it, it was kind of a fun, I was excited about it. It was fun.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the music had to be redone because the music in the 94 version is so much more, at least to me, feels more like orchestral and epic. A lot of the sound in that is so much possibly due to, like you said, to having just time to be able to do it and focus, but is grander. So with like that and the music and stuff, was that, I mean, I know we're talking 25 years ago and whatnot, but is that something you remember as being a focus to try and kind of spruce it up a little bit?
Well, I don't, because that happened in a lot of the creative design meetings before we got involved, because the audio production department was part of show ride engineering. So we weren't always privy to all the, upfront creative meetings.
Sure.
Sometimes we would get in on them, but a lot of times we weren't. So like, by the time we got a word of it, was like everything was designed, done, and, like, here's what we're doing. The ideas for doing grander music and all that stuff, I'm sure there were those discussions, but I personally wasn't involved in any of them.
You mentioned putting on the hard hat and kind of getting with Spaceship Earth. From what I've heard, I mean, just from what I've seen as a ride, it's a very strange layout and such. When you're doing like the effects and all that, are you getting to like get inside there and work at all, or is it all done just outside? As kind of, are you able to get much inside and kind of dig through that area when you're testing things?
Well, when you're testing things, when you're installing the sound, yes. But when you're producing it and creating it in the studio, no. You're familiar with the ride. You've been on it. You know what it's like. And what we would do a lot of times is we would take this is 25 years ago, so we didn't have like the handheld Zoom recorders like we have today. But, you'd take a DAT tape machine and a microphone and just sit in the vehicle and record the ride as you ride through it. We were also, because we were working on it for real, we would have them shut the sound off and just go through and record just the vehicle and the building sound, because, that's a moving car, like I don't know what you call it, omnimover, or yeah. I don't know, but it never stops. And, it's a lot of mechanical devices, always moving, always creating sound. So the biggest thing for me and anybody that worked on the audio for those different attractions was just, what's the noise floor on that ride with everything shut off? Spaceship Earth was relatively loud. It was a I don't know what, I could be wrong on this number, but I think the noise floor was, you may not understand what this is, but it was about 75 to 80 dB, which, in a recording studio, it's down around 35, and that's an exponential curve. So 35 is way quieter than 80.
Well, I don't understand specifically, but I understand the point, because I even notice when I'm writing, especially when you hear you see like an old ride video, I think they've done a better job with that, but the vehicles sound so loud.
They are loud. So what we would do is we would, we would record the ride, just the mechanical sounds of it. And then when we were mixing music or, just making things kind of editing the show together, we would feed that mechanical sound into the studio at the appropriate level. And, none of us were happy with that, because, it's just noise you're inducing, but that's the reality of what the environment was going to be. We would do that with crowd noise and mechanical noise, and just any noise that was going to be part of the show. We wouldn't mix it, but we would have it playing.
Right, because the last thing you want to do is have your sounds, these beautiful, great sounds, and then someone gets on the ride and all they hear is the vehicle.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what would happen. You would hear it in the studio. You'd make this nice mix, and it'd be very subtle. And you go, I can really hear that part. That sounds amazing. That singer's voice is great. And then you get in the ride, and it's just gone, because, there's some mechanical thing right there making some noise all the time. We had a thing at Disney called Disney Way 1, where corporate employees throughout the company could take it's like a 3-day program where they would tour the studio, they would tour Imagineering, and then they would tour Disneyland, kind of a behind the scenes. And it was for people that worked like in marketing and insurance and what I call the non-glamorous jobs at the Disney company. But they would do these tours, and I would play them tracks like from Spaceship Earth, like orchestral stuff, and they would hear it and they'd go, wow, I didn't know that was all going on the ride. I never heard any of that. So it was a bit, from a sound audio production standpoint, it was always a bit frustrating, because the sounds we had in the studio were just so much better than the sounds in the ride. And, because a quieter room, better speaker systems. And I wish Disney fans could hear the original tracks in the studio like I was able to, because they sound amazing.
Oh, man. Because, they have official audio releases and stuff, but even those are not the same, because those are condensed and those are put together more like CD songs. It's not the same thing, I'm sure, than what you're talking about.
No, it isn't, because you're, unless you can hear it in like, a full on, like the studio, like, I know, for example, when we did the tower demos for, I think Eisner was listening to them. But, we set the room up. We set the lighting just right. We had stuff in surround. We had big subwoofers. You really created this sonic environment that was very cool. But in the back of your mind that it's never going to be that when it gets to the attraction. You do the best you can in the studio, and then you do the best you can when you get onto the ride.
Definitely. And I think you've referenced like a bunch of attractions that I want to ask you about, but let's that you've worked on, including one that I didn't know you worked on, but we'll get to that a little later. But American Adventure, let's talk about that since we're at Epcot. So I know you worked on redoing audio from the Golden Dream film, like when they made changes to that in I think it was 93-ish. So what was that experience like, kind of going back in, where there was new scenes and kind of re-recording parts of that?
Well, for me, it was amazing, too, because Golden Dream was one of my favorite Disney songs of all time. So just the fact that I got to remix and do some stuff on it was amazing for me. But, it's a long show. It's 30 minutes. And we only changed the Golden Dream sequence. But we had to extend it out because we had to add in footage of things that had happened over the previous 10 years. We brought in George Wilkins, the composer, and he didn't write the original tune, but he wrote all the choir and all the different arrangement stuff that was used. And it was a lot of fun, just you go out and record the vocals and you take the music tracks and you get to go back into the original tracks, not the mix that you hear in the ride, but all the original recordings from Philadelphia, the orchestral stuff that was done in 78, 79 for the opening of Epcot. And you just get to go back into archival material and just find all these really neat pieces of music that they've always been there, but I've never, you never hear them before. And so you get to bring them into the studio and you kind of, you remix things, and it's, it was a lot of fun for me. And I have that's not a funny story, but when we were mixing Golden Dream, it's a very emotional song if you listen to it, especially when you watch with the images. And so we were mixing it, and we finally got the video edit of, all the new images, and we'd never seen it before. So we thought, well, we'll just, we'll play, we got to play it along and see if everything lines up. And so we put the song up, we lock it to video, and we're playing it, and we get to the end of it, and myself, George Wilkins, and then Ken Lisi, who was the music supervisor at WDI at the time, we're all sitting at the console with tears in our eyes. And we're like, wow, this is pretty powerful. So that was kind of a neat experience for me. It's just one of those things it affected us all emotionally. But then you rewind and do it again, and it becomes less emotional as by the 100th pass, you're over it.
You're just like, okay, JFK, I'm done with you. That's it.
Yeah. But kind of another interesting story on my part with JFK. That he has that the sequence where they show the funeral procession.
Right.
And George had written a bunch of parts. We were playing it all back in the studio, and George goes, "Oh, I forgot to write some snare parts. Uh-oh." And I go, well, George, I play drums. I can probably do that. So, I got a drum, not that day, but I brought a drum in. George wrote some parts and we recorded everything. And, we were able to fill in that spot, put it into the show. So my little bit of drumming is still there to this day.
Well, that's great. So yeah, I'll have to look for that the next time.
I mean, not the drum set part stuff, just the Kennedy funeral sequence parts.
Right. Yeah. That song is still one of my favorites. And even after, I have not watched it 100 times in a row, I'll admit, but even after seeing it a decent amount of times, the film, it all clicks. So it's really cool that you were able to go back and and I believe you also, there's the vocals are different, right? You brought in different female vocalists, right?
Well, it was interesting. The singer the male singer is Richard Page, who was in that group, Mr. Mister.
Right. I remember that.
I don't know if it's not maybe a kept secret, but not everybody knows that. And the original singer, I think, was I'm going to say Marty McCall, but I'm not sure that. I guess she had contacted cancer and passed away, so she was not available to do it. But we got the girl Saida Garrett, who had written "Man in the Mirror" for Michael Jackson and sang on his one of his albums, and so she was the female vocalist. So between her and Richard Page, they knocked it out of the park again. It's just fun to be involved. It's fun to be in the studio when that stuff's being recorded because you're hearing it for the first time, and just when you hear a performer just nail something and you're like, wow, that's amazing sounding, and it's going to be amazing for the next 20 years.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like a show like that, it's going to play, I don't know how many times, 6-8 times a day, whatever, every day and now, they did recently, I believe a few years ago, went back and, at least made the show fix the sound and made it a little nicer. So I think that show will be there. It's not a show that's on the chopping block anytime soon. I think it'll be there as long as probably for a really long time.
Yeah. I think the only issue is that the Golden Dream can't you can't keep making it longer and longer as history marches on. At some point, you might have to, you're going to have to delete some stuff to keep it under it. Because not so much now, but back when Epcot was built, your time limit on those shows was 30 minutes because of the way the audio bin loop tapes were built or made. Analog 24-track tape was only 30 minutes long at running at 15 inches per second. So every show at Epcot was under 30 minutes.
That's interesting. I didn't even think about that because American Adventure is like one of the longest. So
it's like 31, but I can tell you it was from the beginning of the tape to the very end of the tape. There wasn't a lot of spare tape left over when that show was when the bin loop was created. It was long.
That's really interesting. And I want to ask you about Tower of Terror because I know you mentioned that briefly, and the Walt Disney World version especially is just, for sound, I can't imagine almost a better attraction to work on because so much of that attraction is sound. Either you're in the dark or the fifth dimension. So what was that like working on it?
Well, it was neat because what was happening at Imagineering for me at the time was Joe Harrington is our sound effects guy. He was mentoring me. And, I kind of have an ear for sound effects, and he was showing me the ropes and teaching me stuff. And so for me, Tower of Terror was the very first sound effects ride that I got to do. Well, I did Food Rocks, but nobody talks about Food Rocks.
Oh, Food Rocks.
Yeah, I did all the crowd sounds for Food Rocks, but to make it seem like it's a live show. But Tower was the first real attraction, I called it. That it was interesting, and I was given this book. It was just a storyboard. It had the whole, everything, just all like drawings of what was going to happen in kind of a rough script. And it was like, here you go, make some sound for stuff. And that was kind of it. It was a lot of people worked on Tower. I love to take credit for working on all of it, but I didn't. Joe did the fifth dimension. My task was the boiler room, the queue line area, and the ascent shaft and the drop shafts. The meat and potatoes of the ride, although I think the fifth dimension is very cool. But it's, so I had all the drop shafts and the, ascent shafts.
It's still a big part of it. I mean, obviously.
Well, yeah, I like to think it is.
No, and I'm not downplaying it at all. I just think though that like when you at the beginning when you go up, obviously, and then especially when you get through the fifth dimension and the sound right on there, right before you drop, all of that. I mean, you don't even think about it if you can easily forget, but that sets everything up so well. I mean, so when you're doing that, especially for either the ascent or the drop, like the weird thing is it's kind of subtle. It doesn't hit you over the head, which is really hard, I think, for that.
Yeah, but I think that's probably more by accident than design. I think it's like, anything art. I mean, Marty Sklar used to have this thing of, he'd say, everybody at Imagineering had a blank piece of paper in front of them. And when you started doing something, you had that blank paper and you would just start drawing, or in my case, doing sound. So, I was given this book and said, here, make some sound for it. So I didn't really have a plan. I just kind of started, what would I want to hear? You have the drawings, you have the pictures, and you talk to the show producer. They have they have a concept of what they want to hear. And, this isn't, nothing at WDI is done in a vacuum. It's always a team. There's always people you're involved with in meetings, and you would do mock-ups and you play sound for people, and they'd always come in and review it. But there was no real direction. It was just like, here's the book, look at the pictures and make some sound that matches the pictures. And that's what I did.
So you mentioned when you wrote Spaceship Earth, I mean, when you did Spaceship Earth, you would ride it and test it. Now that makes sense for Spaceship Earth, but did you do that in Tower? Because to me, that feels like a little bit harder to actually ride and test out in the same way.
Absolutely, I did that in Tower. We, not just me, but several of us rode that thing, I don't want to say hundreds of times, but maybe cumulative over time, hundreds of times. But yeah, we were in it a lot because we had to, the thing was, it was a new ride system. So the ride engineers were not really, they were sure that it worked, but they weren't really sure how the timings, how accurate things would be. And so we wanted to make sounds that would match the movement of the elevator. And, this was before, digital audio existed, yes, but we didn't have the ability to like run random shows and all that kind of stuff like we do now, or they do now. So I sat in there with a stopwatch and a notepad, and I still have that notepad, with the timings on it. And you just, 1.5 seconds to here, 2 seconds there, halt for 3 at the top, and then drop. And what you do is you make some edits, and you make the edits slightly, you make 2 or 3 different versions, and then you go back out there and you install it and you ride it and go, that didn't feel right, I got to change this. And, there was production facilities down in Florida. So you'd go over, to one of the studios there at the park, actually, and do some edits and go back and reinstall it at night and try it again. And just, it's very repetitive.
Keep dropping.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because the first time you ride it, like everybody, it's just you don't have any idea what's happening. Your senses are overwhelmed. But, by the 25th or 30th time, you're very relaxed, and I wouldn't say the thrill is gone, but the thrill is kind of gone. You know what to expect. It's fun to do, but it's the initial thrill is gone.
Well, yeah, and at least then they only dropped you once. Like now they have the random sequences where you go down and back up and down and back up, and I'm like, that would be hard to test.
Yeah, now it's like, now you're just like at the end of a yo-yo is what you are. And, I don't know, I haven't been involved. I worked on the original one, and then the second version, Tower of Terror 2. And I think they're probably on 6 or 7 now. I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how they're doing it now with randomness. They might just be feeding sound in there and just letting it just run. And, because everybody's screaming, it's, right. It's not a very subtle environment.
Yeah, and you can hear the machine the elevator going up and down and all of that. So it's it's different. That's interesting.
Yeah, there was some interesting, but there was, I got stories for days of everything. But my favorite story was we were working on it one night, and there were 4 or 5 of us in the ride vehicle, just working on stuff. And there's an intercom down to the control room, and the ride engineer said, he goes, "Okay, I'm gonna park you at the top. Well, I do a couple things, and I'll let you know before I drop it." And we go, "Okay, great." So he parks us at the top, and this is 2 or 3 in the morning. It's, it's Florida, so it's not really cold. We're just sitting up there and we're just chatting. And after about 20 minutes, we forgot we're on the ride because we've been sitting there for so long. And then all of a sudden he just drops it. He didn't tell us. And out of the blue, we just started falling. And I can tell you the thrill was back there for that moment. We get to the bottom. He just comes on. He says, "Oh, sorry about that." But, it was on purpose. But it was funny. So it's a story I have to this day.
Well, you got the thrill back, I guess.
Yeah, I certainly did.
I wouldn't even be neglectful if my listeners would be upset if I didn't at least say, do you have any good stories of working on Food Rocks? Working on the sound? Like, real quick, what was that kind of like?
I don't have any great stories. We, all the singers, okay, I've got a couple, I guess. My job on that show was to create all the crowd sounds, like all the cheering, all the clapping, all that kind of stuff. So that's what I did. So I pulled, I took concert sounds from different concert albums that I owned and just, dumped it all into my editor and just matched to the music. But it was kind of fun. And I was present, but I wasn't doing the actual recording because that wasn't my assignment at the time. But when I think Neil Sedaka came in, the Pointer Sisters came in, they all came into WDI and did their recordings there. So that was kind of fun, with all these singers coming in. And I can tell you, it's a funny drummer story. We had recorded, a lot of the tracks with studio musicians, and studio musicians are amazingly great. They can just play anything that you put in front of them. And so we played the Peter Gabriel song, Sledgehammer. Anyway, I forget what the Food Rocks name was.
Yeah, I forget too, but I know it's a take on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we did it. We recorded it, and we sent it to Peter Gabriel for approval. And he came back and he said, he goes, "It sounds great." He goes, "But it doesn't groove right. I'm not feeling the groove." He goes, "It doesn't have the right feel to me." And we said, "Okay, well, we'll work on it." We took the session drums and we did some editing and kind of made them less perfect than they were because, session guys and girls are pretty much just right on every time. So we kind of made it a little rougher sounding. Like, the rhythm wasn't exactly perfect every time. And then we sent it back to him and he goes, "Yeah, that's it. That's good." So that's my Food Rock story. It's not very exciting, but...
Oh, I like it. The idea of Peter Gabriel listening to that and kind of going through and being like, "Oh, I'm just not feeling it." And I love that story because it's so random to think of this artist who's kind of, a little esoteric and stuff in the way he thinks about things, listening to, and I'm gonna quickly find it just because it's gonna bother me. Oh, High Fiber, yes, that was the name of the song.
Yeah,
by Peter Gabriel, P-I-T-A.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but the coolest thing for me out of the whole deal was that at that time, Disney owned Hollywood Records, which had Queen on their label. So one day, we were using Bohemian Rhapsody at the end of the show. And one day this tape arrived, and it was the 24-track mixed master tape from a Bohemian Rhapsody. It was, it wasn't the original, but it was a copy. And it was from Queen. And it was like, so we had all the, we had every track from Bohemian Rhapsody unmixed. Wow. All the alternate guitar solos, alternate takes from Freddie, all the different parts. And you could hear you hear things that weren't in the mix. Like you can hear the piano, keeping time. You can hear people counting off stuff. So it was neat to kind of we just put it up and just all played it and listened to it and went, wow, kind of like dissecting a masterpiece. That was pretty amazing. So we ended up, so all the stuff at the end of the show, when you hear Bohemian Rhapsody, that's all, original Queen stuff that, none of that wasn't re-recorded. That was all original. That was kind of neat, I thought.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That gives me more, I don't know if to say appreciation, but I feel like I'm going to have to find the soundtrack and listen to it again now just for Peter Gabriel, of course, but also for the Queen part.
The original artist did a lot of it, but we had a guy, Jess Harnell, who's a voice actor, and we used him a lot of stuff. And he was the guy he was Sting. He was Peter Gabriel or Peta. He would sing any artist that wasn't the real person.
Well, that's excellent. I have to go back and ask you about Splash Mountain, though, which is one of my favorite attractions. And I know you mentioned you were the boat ride guy at that time. That one being obviously a log flume, but also having a lot of music and a lot of just sounds in general. Kind of how was that experience?
It was, I don't want to say overwhelming, but it was busy because while we were working on Florida, we were also working on Tokyo Splash simultaneously. So I was working on 2 of those shows, and there's 100 and some tracks in each, for each ride. And especially in Florida, we used all new music. We used the bluegrass sound. So what was cool about that was we went to Nashville and recorded guys playing, bluegrass. And we recorded all the background music. So we were down in Nashville for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, just, recording every day. And those guys are all pretty amazing. They're all amazing musicians in the first place. And, they would play stuff. And because what we were doing is we were using a lot of the singing voices from California that had been pre-recorded, the guys in Nashville had to play to a click track at the right tempo and the right key. And, the key that the original stuff was written by Debney, and it was in a key that was good for orchestral instruments, but that's not the same key that's good for banjos. So what happened was, these guys could play in any key, but, the instruments they were playing in keys that they're not used to playing in. And look, they were great. They did it amazingly well. But they were playing notes they normally don't play.
Right. It wasn't their preferred approach.
It wasn't. But they were able to, really nail it. They were really good at, what they did, and they were able to play stuff, and they just nailed it. I think it's Charlie McCoy was his name, the harmonica player. Because the original pieces, like for Zippity Doo Dah, were written in different keys as the song went on, no one harmonica would play all the notes in the song. So Charlie had to play 2 bars and then stop, and we'd back up and then go punch in. He'd play the next 2 bars on a different harmonica, back up, punch in. So that the performance of the harmonica on Zippity Doo Dah in Florida could never be played live by one person. There's so many different keys in that song that it modulates so much that the harmonica harmonicas all have a certain range they play in. And he had 4 or 5 on his stand, but he couldn't do them all at once. So that was bit of trivia that maybe nobody cares about, but it's there.
I think people do, because it's fascinating, because even as learning more and more about how music's put together, there are so many things I don't consider. Like you mentioned, even with what the bluegrass guys had to do, and with the harmonica, I never would have thought, when I hear that, I would never think that was recorded the way you just described. So that's really cool.
I guess the funny part is that when we went to record it, we didn't think we were going to do that either. But he played 2 bars in, and he stops. He goes, I can't play any more notes on this instrument. But he goes, I can do it on that instrument. So it's kind of it was sort of a surprise to all of us, I think.
I can imagine, but it all came together well, because I feel like the music on, I've mostly ridden Disney World, but the music on the Disney World one, that style, especially in the early parts of that attraction, like when you're just kind of rolling along and you can hear the music, it really sets the mood well. It's really good.
Yeah, we were happy with it. There is one bit of music trivia. As you go up the up ramp with the vultures, when you go up that last ramp, it's an orchestral piece, which of course is totally out of character from the rest of the ride. And that orchestral piece was originally recorded for Disneyland, but never used. We were looking for something at that end, and I had that track and I played it for the producers, and they said, yeah, let's use that. So Walt Disney World Splash has a Disneyland track that is not heard at Disneyland. And again, a bit of music trivia that not the end of the world, but something.
No, I think it's good. And that moment, I didn't really think it's outside the ride, but that moment really fits, because all of a sudden it becomes really ominous. Like it's all bluegrass and fun, and then it's like, whoa, we've changed it.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, it's sort of that Darth Vader dun 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 dun. It's got a very evil sound to it, but it's totally
in the back and everything.
Yeah, but all the singing, most of the singing, not all of it, but probably 80% of the singing was stuff that was already recorded for Disneyland. We just that's why the guys in Nashville had to play to existing tracks, because we used a lot of the same singers, or not the singers, but the same tracks. Splash Mountain was a huge project. I could go on, but I don't know that everybody wants to hear all of it.
People love Splash Mountain, but I don't, obviously just in general, you described, I mean, was it a challenge? Like you mentioned you had to do two at once. So was that a challenge to kind of, I mean, you mentioned to balance it, or was it just a really hectic time to kind of move back and forth?
It was a very hectic time. It was, while you're doing the production work, it's not so bad because you're in the studio and you're going, okay, I'm mixing music, but this music's going to be used in both rides. So I'm killing two birds with one stone here. Where it got tricky was during installation, because installation is a lot of different disciplines there at one time. And no matter what the schedule says, you never really kind of stick to it because there's so many things that happen that just delay it or move it or change things. It was just, for me, 1992 was just like a crazy year because February I was in France, and then in April I was in Florida, and then May or June I was in Tokyo. It was just a lot of installation work. And so during the production part, it wasn't so bad, but when it got to installation, it got kind of crazy.
I can imagine. And you mentioned earlier real quick that you had done some work on Indiana Jones, at least recording some dialogue and such. What was that like? Did you work much on Indiana Jones, or was that kind of a quick project?
No, well, it was a big project, but my only involvement was because I just kind of finished up doing Tower at that time, and when it was kind of ramping up for production. So my only point on that ride was to record. I recorded all the dialogue in it, like John Rhys Davies in the pre-show, and then the Indiana Jones sound-alike for the main show.
Oh, I was trying to remember if that was actually Harrison Ford or not, but
no, it was a sound-alike. It was. Originally I'd heard it was going to be Harrison Ford because I was told that he was coming in, but don't tell anybody because they didn't want to make a big deal about it. They said, just, he's going to be in on this day at this time, but just keep it quiet.
Really, the Indiana Jones in the attraction, I mean, it has a few lines about like, oh, tourists and all that, but it's not like he gives a big monologue. So I feel like doing a sound-alike, it doesn't surprise me as much as it might. And now that I think about it.
Yeah, the story I heard was that, and I didn't hear it firsthand, but that I guess his kids at the time wanted him to do it because they thought it'd be cool for their dad to be in Indiana Jones, the ride. But I don't, that may have just been urban myth or something. So we had talked about before that the noise floor in Indiana Jones is incredibly loud. It's like Spaceship Earth on steroids. It's hard to hear what Indy says anyway. So a sound-alike works just fine.
Yeah, I agree. And so before we kind of finish up here, how long did you ultimately work for Disney, and where kind of did you go next afterwards?
Well, my total time at the company was from 1980 to 1996, so 16 years. And not all of it was at Imagineering. Some of it was at Disneyland Entertainment. A lot of it, 4 years, was at EPCOT Entertainment, and then 6 years on staff at WDI, and then 1 year on contract. So a total of 16 years with the company. And then after that, I, of all places, I went to work for a company called iWorks Entertainment, which, if you know your Disney history, iWorks was Walt's first partner back in, I think, Kansas City.
Yeah.
And so anyway, Ub's son, Don, one of his sons, worked at the studio for years. And when he retired from the studio, he formed basically a ride simulation film company. And that's where I went to work. So I started working on the same thing that we're working on at Disney, but just not at Disney. Out here in California, next door to Disney is Universal. And I'll be honest, they were doing hiring too. So I did some contract work with Universal, did some audio design work. I was part of a team. We worked on Islands of Adventure. So, did a little work for Universal. And then I went back into the film post-production world and worked on some movies, of which most of which you've not heard of. But I did work on it was the third of the Honey, We Shrunk the Audience, or Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves trilogy with Disney. I had worked on, at Disney, I had worked on the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids playset adventure at Studio. That was my first project. I did all the ADR dialogue recording for the Honey, We Shrunk the Audience 3D film at Epcot. And then when I got out, after I left Disney, I was working on Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves. So I have quite a history with the Honey, We Shrunk franchise.
Well, I'm familiar with some of the sequels just based on having young daughters, and sometimes it's just you find a film that you put on. So I think they've seen Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves, actually.
Well, if you watch Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves and you roll through the credits, my name's at the end.
Excellent.
I can't leave without saying this. The best film I worked on at that time was a great B film called Barbed Wire with Pamela Anderson.
Yes, I remember that
and
movie.
It's almost like a cult film, I think, because every time I mention it, everybody's heard of it yet. It's just, anyway, I did sound effects. I mean, I was part of the sound effects team, or 2 or 3 of us that worked on it. So I did film work, and then I worked for iWorks, and I'm working in the video game world.
Excellent. I have to ask you about one other project you worked on, which was the Stargate SG-3000 attraction, I believe you worked on, which I'm a fan of that TV show. So I was curious. I've never experienced that attraction. It was not out that long, but what was that like?
Well, that was a ride film attraction. It was done for a theme park in Germany, specifically for that theme park. And I don't know that it was ever meant to play anywhere else. And that theme park has long closed, so you'll never hear it. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun because it was, we got Don Davis. I think that was his name.
Davis,
the general. Yeah. So he did all his own voiceover. We had a sound-alike for Richard Dean Anderson because he wasn't available to do that. So we had a sound-alike there. I got a lot of the sound effects, which was kind of cool. I got a lot of the original sound effects from, the sound designer on the show. So all the effects in that ride film are from the show. So we were authentic in that sense. And it was, 4.5 minute ride film, or 4 minutes. And it was just, kind of it was your classic ride film. You start out, something breaks, you're out of control, you fix it, and then you save the world, and then the ride's over. It's every ride, but it was fun. It's like Star Tours, only Stargate.
Yeah, and I think I read somewhere that it did play briefly at a few Six Flags parks after the Germany park, but again, I think it was like a year or so, and then it was quickly gone because of licensing and such.
Well, yeah, the way it works is that outside of Disney and Universal, there's a lot of special venue theaters throughout the world, and they need content. And so this film was done and in the can, and just basically at iWorks, we had, I guess, a license for it or the right to distribute it. And, we would, as part of our catalog, we'd send it out to potential theater sites and say, here's your list of films you can choose from. And so some theaters did take it. So it did play outside of the German theme park area, but not for long. They would usually sign maybe a 6-month lease on a film. So it would play for six months, and then that would be it.
So you mentioned you're in the video game industry now. Is that what you're currently still working on for the time being?
To be honest, what I'm currently working on right now, I can't tell you. All I can say is that when it gets done, you'll know it's done. So yeah, I'm working. What I can talk about is I'm working in the video game world right now. I was working on a AAA game. Which is a PC-based game called WildStar, and it came out, and the game was pretty amazing, graphics and all the work we did on it, but it didn't sell very well, so it's been shuttered. But I'm working on a couple they're called indie games, and they're smaller games, and they're much less work. On the WildStar game, we had 8 people on our sound design staff, and just for 4 years, just working on things. These indie games, it's me. And just me, but they're fun because they're kind of like the Wild West. They're just it's a small team. It's very fluid, and just it's very like, can you do this? Yeah, I can do that. Okay, send it over. All right, you got it. It's just very. I don't want to say it's unorganized, but it's very it's Wild West. I call it.
That sounds cool. It sounds like a lot of fun. And Greg, this has been amazing. Thanks for telling me all the great stories. I really appreciate the time being on the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Hopefully people enjoyed the stories, and I've got more.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.
Well, that was great. I really enjoyed talking with Greg, and I was a little nervous right after our recording if you'd actually ever hear this show. I had some computer issues where I thought this episode might be lost, but luckily I was able to retrieve it, and I wanted to give thanks out to Greg for being super cool. He volunteered to record again if needed, but luckily we were able to bring this original conversation to you today. And if you enjoyed this conversation, you should check out my discussions with Steve Alcorn and Rick Harper and Peggy Ferris, all who worked with Imagineering on EPCOT Center in some capacity. You can find those podcasts and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com. If you'd like to connect with me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook or Instagram at tomorrowsociety. And if you'd like to become an official member through Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety to help support the show. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be giving a detailed trip report about my recent trip to Aulani, a Disney resort and spa in Hawaii. It was incredible, and I have a lot to say about every step of the process, from planning a trip to Hawaii to the rooms, the dining, all the amenities at the resort. We were there for a full week, and I'm going to be giving you probably more information than you will ever want to know about Aulani during that podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again next time.